Well, welcome everybody. Really happy that you could join us today for Linda Durnell's Oral QE. And she's going to be talking to us today about virtual reality. Specifically, she's looking at changing behavior and impacting social advocacy. So Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sherry Lynn. And thanks everybody for joining me today to hear exactly how virtual reality is changing behavior. And the main purpose of this oral QE is basically to explain what I researched, what I'm thinking based on my research, and where my QE has led me. And that little descriptive was for the people that really don't know what a QE is, which I didn't either, but now I do. I'm also going to present a few of the major points of the foundational theories and research approaches to understanding VR and its impact on behavioral change. And so we have three areas being discussed today: VR, behavioral change, and social advocacy. So I'd like to begin with a brief overview of VR. And I found that with the rapid rate of change in the virtual reality space since 1989, it really complicates an attempt at a definition. I mean, it's just so new that people are defining it in all kinds of different ways. But the various definitions of VR include in part other terms and acronyms, including AR, which is augmented reality, MR, which is mixed reality, IR, which is interactive reality, to name a few, and these provide immersion to a lesser degree than VR. So AR and VR have been used in the past interchangeably, but a distinction is now being made. Those immersed in VR is when an individual is in a world that does not exist. And being immersed in AR is when the individual sees actual reality, but with virtual components superimposed. Now, Nintendo's mobile game Pokemon Go is a great example of AR because when you're playing the game, you're able to see a Pokemon on your screen in the natural setting of what's in front of you. So that kind of gives you an idea. And then what's really interesting about immersive in VR is that although the user knows from a cognitive point of view that the virtual environment is not a real place, they act and think as if the virtual environment was real. So then it has to say to ask what virtual reality is almost to ask what is reality anymore. We are beginning to consider new possibilities, new options across all fronts of human behavior. For those in publishing, marketing, education, research, VR is opening the door for developing immersive content, storytelling, educating, and impacting social change. We've got younger generations that are looking upon VR as a tool to empower their future, while the rest of us are reworking our existing businesses and dissertations to incorporate VR technology. However, VR is still beyond the reach of the masses, yet the industry is currently building better and more cost-effective VR tools that will reduce its complexity and be available for mass marketing. So 2016 has already been a historic year for VR, and we're beginning to see virtual reality achieving significant traction. With the consumer launches of Oculus Rift, Vive, Samsung Gear, VR experiences are expanding beyond the hardcore gaming community and into everyday screens. Now, this story arc also shows the adoption of VR content. Now, the Emblematic Group have been working on a new form of journalism that combines traditional reporting with VR, which puts the audience inside the story. They produce VR content designed to influence behavioral change, whereby the realities in the virtual world can push people to feel differently or more deeply, to see things in a way. For example, they produced a VR simulation that reveals the horror of being virtually present at the beating of a handcuffed immigrant. These types of VR experiences have the potential to foster lasting behavioral change. Now, behavioral change can be loosely defined as an action taken by a person with a goal of transformation by a process of outside intervention. There'll be a test later on that one. Behavioral change can be more successful if 1, people are in an environment conducive to change. 2, if other people are seen adopting the change. And 3, if the new behavior is encouraged, supported, and reinforced. In Pam's new book, Exploring Positive Psychology, she states that successful behavioral change can be encouraged, and facilitated for long-term success through institutions such as governments, organizations, communities, and families that are committed to support the development of virtues and positive emotions. So understanding it in this way makes me think that if change is a conscious decision, will VR become part of life, almost like a new but natural default setting? With the use and adoption of VR, its impact on people is an important consideration. And shared human connection and experiences via storytelling can help change human behavior. As such, VR is reinventing expectations of what a narrative can be. For example, during the storytelling experience, the content could change based on an individual's emotional response. And what may matter more than the device or the technology is the story, ultimately to choose one's own adventure. But how will we experience the stories of the future? Imagine being able to live stories that are as rich and fantastic as the movies we see. That's the direction that VR is moving toward. Technology may not be perfect yet, but we can see how it's possible. The way audiences exist in the future may not be watching a movie on a screen or on a wall. It's living the stories together and having that shared experiences when people feel the movie together. It's a collective experience. It has the potential to make the bond between people more powerful. VR content is also designed to influence behavioral change. For some, 360 video or photo experience is not true VR. Now, I think we need to distinguish between the two because it's important to clarify which one offers a point of view and a means of looking around, and the one that is more immersive and undeniably compelling. Now, true VR enables the user to interact in some way with the content and choose a path within the experience. Now, the VR environment has been explained as a medium for the extension of body and mind. Now, we're going to be moving in a little bit into some foundational theories, and in this slide, if this slide is new to any new student, then you have not been paying attention at winter session or listening carefully enough to Gary speak. Gary introduced me to this approach years ago, and it has served me well in a variety of circumstances. In The Practical Theorist, Lewin's scientific thinking can best be described as seeking a deeper explanation of why people behave as they do, and to discover how they may learn to behave better. So very simply, Lewin's force field analysis is a way of looking at pattern behavior. Change that takes place when an imbalance occurs between the sum of forces against change and the sum of forces for change. It helps to identify forces operating on both sides of an issue. And in this case, I applied it to the adoption of VR for behavioral change and social advocacy. So force field analysis could be used to reduce the forces invested in maintaining the technological status quo or changing the current mindset towards VR. Now, Lewin has been criticized by scholars for oversimplifying the change process, but I think in the complex and rapidly changing technology field, this simplification could be invaluable in systematically analyzing the complexities that confront VR. McLuhan developed the tetrad for these 4 questions, which I applied as a means of examining the effects of VR. First, what is technology, VR technology enhance? Now, research on VR experiences have demonstrated an increase in human communication, connection, and that VR profoundly transforms learning, empathy, different types of therapy, and even use in medical applications. VR also enhances people's sensitivity towards nature and also towards each other. VR can give people a renewed appreciation of their physical reality. Further, VR may change the way people receive the news. For example, the AOL Huffington Post acquisition of the production firm Riot back last April is standardizing 360-degree video production for news stories. So 2, what does VR technology make obsolete? A dramatic development of VR is that it has the potential to fundamentally change the landscape of how people experience stories. So people in a virtual environment have a role within the medium. Their actions have an observable impact on the content as they are active and cognitively engaged. The impact VR makes on existing entertainment choices may build in obsolescence with existing forms of media. So virtual reality is also a technology that may be able to retrieve what was previously rendered obsolete. For example, people's ability to travel to distant locations and sacred sites have been difficult to access due to the artifacts or the sites themselves residing in conflict zones. Due to political unrest, they may be lost forever. So VR technology can preserve those lost artifacts or civilizations, and in some instances, even bring them back to life. And I think Anna is working on something like this project. So if you want to know more, ask her about this as well. However, as technology becomes more powerful, the importance may not be in how people access information and technology, but how people make sense of it. So the last one, what happens when VR technology pushes people to extremes? As virtual environments become more commonplace, the long-term effects on human behavior it remains to be seen. We really don't know yet. As immersive and compelling as the VR experience may be, the social aspect is lacking, and at the extreme, VR may contribute to people becoming more socially isolated through this medium. Then we have Lewin's three-step change model, which is good at examining new solutions for social change, developing new behaviors, and addressing the changes inherent in immersive life. Now, recognizing the need for change and for new solutions, this model may assist in understanding and driving the use of VR for social advocacy uses. VR may be applied to alter a person's behaviors and their reaction to stimuli. Now, for example, at the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab, try saying that 5 times, I experienced a 360-degree virtual underwater ecosystem, which provided me the experience of looking at how coral reefs might appear by the end of the century if carbon emissions were not curbed, which is the unfreeze state. If the individual tries to imagine what the world will look like if human-caused carbon dioxide emissions were not curbed, their imagination and scientific knowledge would not be as effective as if they utilized VR to help them experience what I experienced, which was the bottom of the sea and the ability to view coral reefs, some healthy and some bleached and dying, which is the transition state. In this example, my experience and emotional feeling developed a new behavior, which is the freeze state. Understanding that there is a behavioral difference between watching and experiencing. Now, the theory of reasoned action was formulated to understand the discrepancy between attitude and behavior. The reasoned action approach has emerged as the dominant conceptual framework for predicting, explaining, and changing human social behavior. This principle may be well suited to support VR as a person's attitude towards an action, the feeling of social pressure to act, and their ability to control their behavior are all factors in virtual environments, and it may impact how VR and social advocacy affects behavior. Then I looked at social cognitive theory, and Bandura's theory can be used as a framework to understand how VR shapes behavior and impacts social advocacy by way of addressing human motivation and action. Now, social cognitive theory has been applied to social change in the past, and his theory analyzes the determinants and processes governing social change and integrates modeling and social network to illustrate how technological changes are transforming the scope of human influence. A particular interest is vicarious capability and how it might apply to the adoption of VR as an advocacy solution. Vicarious in this instance refers to something experienced through the feelings or actions of another. In a VR experience, it may be possible to support different advocacy outcomes if the immersive experience could create a strong feeling or belief in the participants of their capabilities. Now, if this condition can be achieved, the participants' efforts or actions might be greater and even more persistent. Although these fields here are not in my area of research, this slide shows that virtual environments may change people's experiences and indicates that a relationship between VR and behavior change may exist. Now, there's a couple other things that affect behavior change. VR stories place the viewer in the center of a situation they might not otherwise experience, and this has the potential to stir emotions in an entirely new way. For example, in a virtual environment, being at the top of Mount Everest, or experiencing war as it happens, or being transported to the middle of a natural disaster are all experiences that bring deep emotions to the surface, something that publishers and journalists have always sought to arouse in audiences. VR today is, for the most part, a solitary media experience, but there are promotional events that gather people together to experience VR content, and this provides new experiences for those people. The emotional aspect of VR brings all your senses to life. Now, this was just announced this week, a couple days ago. The Emblematic Group put VR users in the middle of breaking news stories for the very first time. Now, these emotional stories can show what it feels like to face a natural disaster or how to escape from a tsunami. There's also social influence, which is described as the way people influence others and themselves, their attitudes and their behaviors. In other words, persuasion. The psychological processes involved in persuasion and other forms of social influence have been studied at length. But socially influencing one another within immersive virtual environments is relatively recent and may impact both behavioral change and advocacy. Because of the widespread adoption of technology innovation that influence behavior, such as online shopping, Twitter communication, emails, texting, FaceTime, virtual environments, the study of virtual social influence promises to expand further. Now, William James wrote in the late 1800s that bodily changes follow directly the perception of an exciting fact. In other words, the bodily state follows the perception. Now, this is a key point here, and thanks to Jerry Lynn for pointing it out that I needed to expand on it in my QE. Today, through neuroimaging, we know that emotions are like perceptions and memories, in that they are reconstructed from data we have access to. Now, much of that data comes from our unconscious, as it processes data by senses and creates a physiological response. Now, our brain detects through our senses. Sensory perception is just one of the many areas of mental processing which the brain operates at the unconscious level. Our nonverbal sensors, and this is really interesting, are so powerful that just the movements associated with body language are enough to accurately perceive emotion. Now, this is a salient point, as many researchers, filmmakers, and content providers are using avatars in VR to elicit strong emotional responses, especially in social advocacy documentaries. Now, with the advent of new technology, researchers are beginning to understand in more detail the origins and depth of the unconscious. But because the unconscious mind is a master at constructing a version of the world that appears realistic and completes the conscious mind, we don't know how this will impact people who experience VR. Measuring emotions experienced in the immersive world is a new endeavor. Now, Wundt believed that everything must be measured, which is especially relevant when we try to quantify and measure emotions in VR. Basically, perception, memory, and even emotions are all constructs made of a mix of data, but to date, the research is very limited. So now I'm going to move on from behavioral change to social advocacy. Now, defining advocacy within the context of VR broadens the understanding of social movements from which most activism is created. Nonprofit organizations and filmmakers are responding to VR's ability to tell stories, to raise awareness for their causes. Advocates are embracing VR to push for social change. VR is becoming one of the ways to use cognition, emotion, and behavioral strategies to influence others' attitudes and decisions. Blaskovich examined the impact of VR on pro-social behavior, advocacy, and group processes, and found that approximately the same proportion of people expressed concern for a virtual person observed in VR as they did for a real person observed in the real world environment. Now, let me say that again. His research found that the same proportion of people expressed concern for a virtual person in VR as they did for a real person in a real-world environment. Little scholarly information, however, exists specifically on VR and social advocacy. I mean, very little. And you can find some, please send it to me. But companies are promoting their products regardless to that end. Oculus is moving VR into a medium for social change with filmmakers who use VR to tell stories with an emotional impact. A recent initiative called VR for Good launched 2 pilot VR film programs to inspire high school students, VR filmmakers, and nonprofit organizations to create social change content. VR Together was announced just this week with support from Samsung, VR Production Studios, and Noni de la Peña, who's a journalist that has been using VR to tell her stories for years. It's a platform that will allow developers and creators to pitch projects that they need help with, linking them with other companies, individuals to offer support, skills, ideas, and even equipment. It essentially gives VR companies a good platform to use their talents. This company here is what I was thinking that maybe even some of our media psych students could access to help further some of their projects as well. I was excited to see it. Now, there are more companies like VR Together, which are committed to promoting ideas, projects, technologies which have the impact to improve human lives. The aim is to bring together and support people who have the desire to research and develop work that affects the areas of healthcare, science, entertainment, education, and environmental concerns. But until now, storytelling mediums have allowed us to share approximations of human experience in forms that take up space in the physical world, which is books, movie screens, TVs, smartphones, computer screens, and the like. While the stories we tell using these forms help bring us closer to ever to the lived experiences of others, they don't give us the ability to live within those experiences firsthand. Now, you can tell a very emotional story in VR and put people in the shoes of those who are in crisis, and people will understand. Now, imagine immersing yourself in this story. How would your behavior change? People can experience through a body a fundamentally new technology platform, one that will change how they communicate, connect, and tell stories. I think VR is just its first manifestation. The 6-week program called 360 Filmmakers Challenge that I just mentioned earlier will be debuting the students' films at the Sundance Film Festival in January next month. So it will be VR and technology for good on display, and I'm super excited to see what they came up with. But in the long term, I think VR may lead to the democratization of the human experience, the same way the internet led to the democratization of data, which is accessible to everyone. So now we can move on to research methodology. And virtual reality has made its way, finally, into mainstream psychological research. The prevalence of and people's exposure to VR and virtual environments suggests that they are becoming a necessary topic of scientific study. This technique, ability to stimulate complex and real situations and contexts, offers researchers opportunities to investigate human behavior in well-controlled designs in lab. Applying VR to understand behavioral change, or using VR as a technique for studying social advocacy through the visceral experience, are both approaches that could be utilized in my area of focus. Now, content analysis may be an effective option for researching existing VR and social change. Now, listed on the slide are examples of sources that may be used for content analysis. In other words, a data set to study some type of activity, to lead toward a new perspective. We've got the United Nations Millennial Campaign, and they've coordinated the Virtual Reality Series project to bring the world's most pressing challenges to decision makers and citizens around the world. People can watch their content with a smartphone, and it's available for both regular 360 viewing and for use with Google Cardboard. There's Clouds Over Syria, which shows life for refugees from one child's perspective and was made in partnership with the UN and Samsung. This was shown at the World Economic Forum in January of 2016, where state and business leaders were given a chance to watch it. They also created Across the Line, a virtual reality film produced in partnership with Planned Parenthood, which places the viewer in the shoes of a woman enduring hateful slurs on her way into the clinic. The Toronto Film Festival, for the first time in its 41-year history, included virtual reality as part of its festival programming. This included 25 partners, including the U.S. Consulate in Canada. Then you have the Festival of International Virtual and Augmented Reality Stories. This is the first event to feature the most cutting-edge virtual and augmented reality narratives in the world. And then the Tribeca Film Festival this year showcased VR documentaries. But this one is dated, and this is the New York Times, is dated for VR because it was 2015, super old. But I wanted to include it because it's so interesting, and I think it foretells sort of what's coming. And that is the New York Times app was launched in November of 2015, and it became the most successful app launch in their history. They reached 1 million users at launch, driven in part by distribution of 1 million Google Cardboard viewers to Sunday subscribers. They also sent out VR Cardboard to more than 300,000 of their digital subscribers. The app to date has had more than 950,000 downloads. So as technological cost barriers are removed surrounding VR, this technology could be used to qualitatively study social advocacy and behavioral change. One approach might be to use existing content, some of which I just mentioned, and have people experience it, and have another group look at non-interactive media. It could illustrate a participant's emotional responses or action towards advocacy. Now, through a quantitative approach, I could use a survey questionnaire, interview a sample of users, and develop an understanding of VR's ability to influence behavioral change, or indicate a willingness to change. Using statistical analysis from a questionnaire, data from interviews may support the view that social cognitive theory can be used to help understand the capabilities of adopting VR as an advocacy solution. So when I pulled it all together, that part of the QE, based on the research I reviewed, I believe that the reasoned action theory would probably be an appropriate conceptual framework for predicting, explaining, and changing human social behavior. Because understanding a person's attitudes and their ability to control their behavior are all factors in virtual environments and may impact how VR and social advocacy affects behavior. But because VR is a complex technology that generates complex emotions, using Lewin's change management theory for analyzing the factors found in VR and social advocacy could help in identifying those factors that need to be addressed for behavior change to be successful. So from this literature, I believe that content analysis is likely the methodology best suited to present a cohesive, compelling narrative because there are recent, available, and compelling examples of VR's impact. So I'm hoping this paper demonstrated that VR technology may not only be assisting in directing behavior towards social change, but is playing a growing role in our everyday lives in both traditional mass media and interpersonal interactions. Applying VR to create behavioral change is an application that appears relevant to this area of research. Now, I'd really like to tell you that this is the end of my QE, but in reality, questions arose outside of my original area, and it led me to rethink my direction. Now, Jerry Lynn has assured me numerous times that this is the point of the QE. So I began to think about the future of VR and social advocacy. So in the last 10 days, since I put in my, I got the results back from my written QE, I started thinking, what kind of future will society face? How deeply will society need to be changed? How deeply will it change? How will technology be understood and managed? In my experience, being in tech since the 1980s, 24 months is an eternity in technological innovation. Despite the lean-in approach that we're seeing towards VR, the future is still very much unknown. VR could scale faster than ever, it could fade. However, the predictions of those involved in VR today, hey, they say it trends positively. But that concern aside, I began to think of something that Regina told me a couple of years ago. And it just rattled around in my head the last 10 days. And it said, this is our moment in time. What exactly is reshaping it? So I thought, this is our moment in time. What is reshaping it? What remains constant in our society? Now, my answer is something which we're all familiar with after the election, unfortunately, and that is crisis. Specifically, how do we respond to a crisis? How is crisis reshaping this moment? How do we affect decision-making during crisis? What action is necessary? How does crisis bring to light the need for change? So then I went back to my story arc and added crisis. Now, stay with me here as I'm still kind of in the process of fleshing this idea out. But I began to think that crisis can be applied to the VR story because it's already being successfully used for social advocacy. Most advocacy originates through some type of crisis. And with large-scale viewings already occurring, I felt like VR is poised to be used as a tool to disseminate information that can aid in crisis abatement. So as such, I believe I have a new area of focus. Thank you for my QE process. And that is virtual reality crisis response technology. So crisis and change creates a dynamic complexity, and the next wave of disruption may include VR as a tool for understanding crisis and moving people to action. VR may be used as a crisis response technology. So I look at threats, emergency, dangers, all those things arise from anywhere in a matter of hours. I mean, in an unfolding crisis, VR can put somebody into the story where they don't feel like an outsider or an observer, where you get viewers to feel. Now, if this happens, perhaps it can reduce apathy. Perhaps it can increase empathy. Perhaps assisting in better decision-making. Potentially using VR as a part of a rapid response to crisis. So VR as a crisis response technology may help disseminate information and spur people towards action. Now, I personally learned through fielding simulation with the Department of Defense last year that it is possible to aid a society. We can use technology to solve crisis issues. Virtual reality has an enormous potential for developing assessment, understanding, and educating those who are vulnerable to conflict, chaos, violence, especially the youth. And it is worth repeating, especially considering the military simulation, that VR can be used as a tool to help people understand all perspectives before they make decisions. So ultimately, I believe what I used to tell my kids when they were growing up, what affects the one affects the many. And through VR, the reality of crisis can be experienced with the results being real change and hopefully real tangible compassion. Technology can only take us so far, but with a vision of using VR in response to a crisis to aid in promoting new perspectives and taking action wherever and whenever it is needed, it appears to me that this is worthwhile enough to make it the focus of my dissertation research. So I'd like to end my presentation with this quote from a senior advisor at the UN. It sums up my original QE and my new direction nicely. And the senior advisor says, by leveraging breakthrough technologies such as virtual reality, we can create solidarity with those who are normally excluded and overlooked, amplifying their voices and explaining their situations. So in closing, I want to extend my appreciation to every faculty member for sharing their incredible knowledge base with me and for supporting my growth and development, in effect, making this QE possible. Thanks to all my peers on this call. It really means a lot. And thanks, everyone.